Mark Hanson, and I'm delighted to be talking with you about this profound and fundamental topic of how the mind and the body, or the mind and the brain in particular, are related to each other. This is a classic subject. People, philosophers, saints, and sages alike have been wondering about this, certainly throughout all of human history, and most likely long before that. I'd like to explore it with you with the spirit of curiosity, gratitude for being able to consider the question itself, and respect for what remains mysterious. As the Venerable Ani Tenzin Palmo has written, we ask, what is a thought? We don't know, yet we are thinking continually. So let's explore how we can ground the mind in life and situate our own consciousness in the living body. To enter into this subject, it's worth noting that, of course, for thousands of years, people have been observing their own mental activities. They've been observing their thoughts, their feelings, their hopes, their sorrows, and trying to nudge their own stream of consciousness in for them, a better direction for having, let's say, greater happiness, lifting their mood, healing old pain, and finding even more love and wisdom. For example, 2,500 years ago, the Buddha encouraged people to train yourself in doing good that lasts and brings happiness. Cultivate generosity, the life of peace, and a mind of boundless love. Many people throughout history have not needed an MRI or an EEG or other fancy technology to go far along on their own path of awakening. Or, in more modest terms, to heal from old pain, become more skillful in life, or develop greater grit, gratitude, and compassion. Still, in the last 2,500 years, and certainly in the last 25 years, science has learned a lot, and we have a growing understanding of how our stream of consciousness is based on an underlying stream of neural activity, which itself is connected to other bodily systems. The nervous system is woven together with all the other systems in our body, and our body in turn is, in a sense, woven into the whole fabric of nature, and beyond that, into reality altogether. Apart, clearly, from the possible effects of supernatural or transcendental factors that are meaningfully distinct from the ordinary Big Bang universe in which we live nearly 14 billion years or so after it banged. Apart from all that, apart from whatever might be involved with that, and some would assert that there's nothing but the ordinary natural phenomena within the Big Bang universe. Apart from whatever might be transcendental or supernatural, we're left with only and entirely natural causes, so that our experiences of hearing and seeing, remembering, wanting, loving, and hating are understood as natural phenomena that entirely depend upon causes and conditions in the living body. Subjectively, we can sometimes practice mindfulness of the body. Objectively, we are always body full of mind. To turn away from the grounding of mind in life would be a kind of deliberate ignorance, even delusional, that is antithetical both to science and to the wisdom traditions. Traditions that value clear seeing and the dispelling of illusions. We today have an unprecedented opportunity, historically completely unprecedented, to use our minds, to change our brains, to change our minds for the better, for our own sake, and certainly for the sake as well of other beings. How shall we use this opportunity? That's what I hope to explore with you. Let's start by considering how the brain makes the mind and the mind makes the brain in an interdependent process that's entwined with nature and human culture and the universe altogether. First, a little bit about the hardware, the marvelous brain. This is a picture of a real human brain, no longer alive, and it kind of looks pretty weird, right? I think of it as like, rotten cauliflower. A neurologist friend of mine has described it as 3 pounds of tofu-like tissue inside the coconut. And yet, this particular object is considered by some scientists to be the most complex object known currently to science in the entire universe. Here's a slide that you do not need to take a test on. It just simply points out some of the major regions or structures inside our brain. As we go along, I might say a little bit about some of these, but I'm just showing you this here to give you a sense of an overview of the complexity of what has evolved inside our head. And if we look then more specifically into it, we see that we've got a brain, roughly 1.5 kilos of weight, that contains about 85 billion neurons amidst another 100 billion or so support cells. And the individual neurons are connected with each other on average at about thousands of other neurons, giving us a network inside our own head with several 100 trillion little nodes. So taking a look at what a neuron is, it tends to have a kind of a blobby little body, each one of those 85 billion or so neurons. The structures kind of vary. What you're seeing here is a prototypical neuron. And then extending out from the body, in terms of the receiving ends, are little tendrils that get inputs from other neurons, tendrils called dendrites. And then most neurons have a long wire or multiple long little wire-like structures called axons that connect with other downstream neurons that receive this neuron's signals. So the tendrils extending from the cell body tend to receive signals. The neurons, the tendrils at the end of the long axons tend to transmit signals. The area where neurons interface with each other, and we're talking about several 100 trillion of these inside our own head, is called a synapse. And here too, there's no need to memorize all the details. You can get a sense of the sending little tendril, a tiny little finger-like, hair-like wire, above, releasing packets of neurotransmitter molecules like dopamine or serotonin or GABA or glutamic acid, glutamate, and those little molecules that are released by the sending tendril are taken up on the receiving side of the synapse, much as little docking stations in a port receiving big packages that are distributed from the container vessel ships that are showing up there at the dock. What you're seeing here in the slide has a lot of detail to it, but it's remarkable to appreciate that in the width of a single human hair, you could put roughly 5 or so cell bodies of neurons side by side. But in the width of a single hair, you could put several thousand synapses side by side. It's really remarkable. A typical neuron is firing 5 to 50 times a second. Large patterns of synchronized neural activity involving millions, maybe billions of neurons are firing together at the same time, producing electromagnetic waves that a EEG can pick up. The brain is the realm of the very small, the very fast, and the very complicated. And to give you a kind of a sense of the complexity of the brain, this is a slide from a study that took 1,000 regions of interest in the brain and then cross-correlated them to get a sense of the sort of the roadmap of major activity or major flows of information in the brain. And this gives you a sense in a kind of way. I think of it as like looking down on planet Earth from a satellite from outer space and seeing the lines of light, let's say on the dark side of the planet, where there's a lot of activity. We're connected. Our neural processes are involved very much in a highly distributed network in which there is certainly some localization of function. Different regions of the brain do different things, just like different muscles in our body do different things, and yet the whole brain works together typically to do anything that's significantly important to an individual. A lot of hardware, right? Even though the brain consumes just 2 to 3% of, or rather the brain is just 2 to 3% of our body weight, it consumes 20 to 25% of the oxygen and glucose circulating in the blood. What's the function? What's the evolved purpose of all that fancy hardware? This takes us to the question of what is the mind? So let's look first at some examples of neural correlates, they're called, of our conscious experiences. So one example in this slide that's from a study on physical and social pleasure and pain lists various parts of the brain that are involved with physical pain. Those little points are noted in red there. And interestingly, the parts of the brain that are involved with tracking physical pain also are involved with, to some extent at least, involved with the experience of social pain. In other words, what it feels like when you've been rejected, what it feels like when you've been left out or dismissed or disrespected. What does that feel like? It's uncomfortable, it's painful, and the brain has evolved in such a way that our sense of the social or emotional pain, the suffering there, it rests upon more ancient structures in the brain that handle physical pain. The same is true for physical and social pleasure. You can see in blue regions of the brain that are involved in experiences of pleasure, satisfaction, reward, like eating something that tastes really good. And those parts of the brain also are the basis for, they're involved with, more recently involved capabilities of enjoying social pleasures, like the sense of being loved or how good it feels to be generous to another person. And the larger takeaway here is that as people are having experiences of physical pain or social pain, there are neural correlates of that. In other words, as certain forms of mental activity are occurring, certain kinds of experiences are occurring, there are matched underlying patterns of neural activity. And the same is true for social pleasure and physical pleasure as well. All right? So I'll give you another example here, a different kind of example. What happens when people meditate? Especially, let's say, in this instance, when they're experiencing boundless compassion radiating in all directions. Well, the orangey blob there is a part of the brain called the anterior or frontal cingulate cortex, or the more central aspects of the cingulate cortex in general. And this is a part of the brain that's very involved in deliberate, focused attention. So in this case, someone, a trained Tibetan monk who's just very concentrated with compassion inside an MRI, with the loud sounds, bang, bang, bang going on there. It's a he. In this particular study, he really had to concentrate. And so a part of the brain that's involved with top-down executive regulation of attention, notably the cingulate cortex, especially its more frontal regions, gets more active. And so that increased metabolic activity shows up in an MRI signal. Now, by the way, detail, it's not like the rest of the brain has gone dark and is not active anymore. The area that shows up on the scanner here is maybe 2 to 3% more metabolically active. It's consuming more oxygen, so it creates more of a signal in a sense. It's just a little bit more active, but it's definitely a difference that makes a difference. So here too, we have an example of the ways in which underlying neural activity is the basis for different kinds of mental activity. In this clear way, mind, in the broadest sense, is grounded in living processes. There's so much we don't know. And we do know, nonetheless, that there is a direct and clear relationship, at a minimum as correlation, between what we are experiencing and what our brain is doing. The nervous system has been evolving for about 600 million years. That's a while. And the brain has tripled in volume, for example, in just the past several million years, as our tool-making hominid ancestors began manufacturing tools or began using tools to make tools starting roughly 2.5 million years ago. So the nervous system has been a target of a lot of evolutionary pressure, including over just very recently in terms of evolutionary time. And as I mentioned, the brain itself, which is the headquarters of the nervous system, uses just, or is small relative to the rest of the body, and yet it uses a lot of the oxygen and glucose circulating in the blood. Why would Mother Nature have evolved such a metabolically expensive piece of equipment inside our head that is right now trying to understand what is the evolved function of that piece of hardware inside our head? Why would this happen? What's the function, biologically at least, of the nervous system and its headquarters, the brain? The fundamental purpose of the nervous system is to process information. Much as the cardiovascular system stores blood and moves it around and operates upon it, in much the same way, the purpose of the nervous system is to receive, store, transform, and communicate signals, meanings, messages, instructions, memories, and ideas. I'd like to quote here from the Nobel Prize winner Eric Kandel from his magnificent book, In Search of Memory. And in this slide, I'm bringing together quotations from different pages in that book. Dr. Kandel writes, "All cells have specialized functions. Brain cells have particular ways of processing information and communicating with each other. Nerve cells form complete circuits that carry and transform information." Notice how many times Dr. Kandel is using a word that is either information or very close to it. Electrical signaling represents the language of mind, the means whereby nerve cells, the building blocks of the brain, communicate with one another over great distances. Nerve cells generate electricity as a means of producing messages. All animals have some form of mental life that reflects the architecture of their nervous system. Wow. So what we have here is information that must be represented by something material, including the ways that energy, such as electromagnetic waves, can represent information. For example, vibrations in air. Right now, I'm speaking, and vibrations in air are carrying the information of my words and their meanings to the microphone that is then transforming them further. Information can be carried in marks on a clay tablet starting 5,000 years ago, or marks of a musical score, written out by hand, say. Information can also be represented by electromagnetic waves. Neural structures and processes can represent information too, or the squiggly shapes on this slide. This is it may seem kind of weird and esoteric at first, but we're surrounded by examples of information being represented by some, matter energy substrate, including just a traffic light. The color red, the yellow, and green mean different things. Okay, great. So, good. Information itself is intangible. We cannot touch it or weigh it, right? Yet it clearly exists. So we have two distinct aspects of the universe: information and matter, thoughts and things. So I'd just like to slow down here and pause to kind of let this sink in. Information is real. It's intangible. In a sense, it's immaterial in the sense of not being material. It must be represented by something that is material, including the energy aspects of materiality. And yet it is clearly distinct, because information is intangible, from the material universe. We have these two aspects of the natural universe. Now, here we come to that tricky little word, at least in the English language, a little word, mind. By mind, I mean all of the information represented by a nervous system. Period. It's a straightforward definition. Most of this information lies outside of awareness, buried deeply in the architecture of our nervous system. And it's haunting, and I think it should be humbling to appreciate that we are forever unaware of most of the depths of our own minds, as I am defining that term. There is a tangible nervous system, and there is the intangible information it represents. Clearly, there are also experiences. So I'm moving now from what seems evident and clear, matter and information, and now moving into experiences of pleasure or pain, seeing or hearing, remembering or wanting. Experiences exist as well. It seems undeniable that you are having experiences as you watch this program. I am having experiences as I present it. Experiences exist. Even simple animals like mice are having experiences such as tasting and touching, grounded in structures in their nervous system that are simpler than, but are alike our own. For example, this little mouse here with its cheese is seeing the cheese. It is awake rather than asleep. It is alert. It is responsive to environmental stimuli. It approaches that which is pleasurable for it. It avoids that which is painful. There are many studies that have developed in the last years about complex experiences that even simple rodents seem to be having. There's a kind of kinship. There's a continuum of experiences that animals with nervous systems are having that depend on the complexity and capabilities of their nervous systems. It is possible that very simple creatures, such as ants, who still have eyes, they have receptors for smell, they respond to environmental stimuli in complex ways. They can cooperate with each other to form a living bridge, as you can see in this picture. Maybe ants are zombies, all right, but I don't think a gorilla is a zombie. I think a gorilla is having experiences of seeing and hearing just like I am, or just like you are. And also, much like the baby gorilla is having on its mother's back. So, to summarize, experiences are natural phenomena. They may require or involve something supernatural or transcendental. I accept that possibility as a scientifically minded person. I think that a truly scientific attitude is to appreciate the possibility of what cannot be disproven, in a sense, scientifically. There's a saying in science that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because there's no, super scientific study to show something doesn't mean it does not exist. Even things that are widely accepted to exist, for example, love, there's no scientific study in the world that can prove that, let's say, you love someone or that you don't love someone, or the same for me. So we have experiences that are natural phenomena. They may involve something supernatural or transcendental, but I'm going to, set that aside, the framework of my talk here. And these natural phenomena of experiences are based upon the information processing activity of an animal's nervous system, particularly a very complex animal like a human being. Exactly how that information processing becomes an experience of, let's say, the color red or the smell of a rose, exactly how that happens, including how the mouse is having experiences while eating the cheese, is what's called the hard problem in consciousness studies. And I think, frankly, that we're a century or two away from a complete scientific account of how this all happens. But it is certainly clear that a stream of experiences depends upon a stream of information that depends upon a stream of neural activity. Now let's look at it the other way. I've been looking at relationships, in a sense, from the hardware up. Now let's look at it from the software, in a sense, down. How can the mind change the brain? And how can we use that information in useful ways? Well, for starters, as the brain changes, the mind changes as well. And I want to give you two examples of that, for better or worse. Let's say the mind changing for the better as someone has a cup of coffee, revving up the brain a bit with caffeine, a little more alertness. Or on the other hand, in American football, somebody getting a concussion, literally as a person getting a concussion right there at the moment of impact. So on the one hand, we have clearly, as the brain changes, the mind changes as well, for better or worse. And as the mind changes, as we are having experiences, the brain changes as well. Certainly, at least temporarily. There are many examples of this. This is one particular study, and I'll summarize it without getting into a lot of detail. This was a study done with nuns who were asked inside an MRI to call to mind and to kind of re-experience a very important spiritual experience. And so as their minds changed, as they were having different kinds of experiences, in that moment, their brains changed as well. And in particular, there was activation in the insula, part of the brain that's involved with tuning into the body. Also activation in the ACC, the anterior cingulate cortex, part of the brain that's involved with the deliberate focusing of attention. And there was activation in a part of the brain called the caudate nucleus, which is involved with experiences of reward. The details are not so relevant here. The broad principle is very relevant, as these individuals were calling up a particular different kind of experience. Their brain activity in their brain needed to occur, and their brain changed temporarily, at least as well. I want to give you a little example of this that's experiential that I invite you to do along with me. I call it the 3 breaths practice. You don't need to do it, but in effect, I'm going to ask you to do something and then explain briefly what was happening in your brain while you did it. So, if you want to, first breath, breathing while feeling your chest as a whole. And breathing while feeling caring. Just simple, bringing to mind a friend, someone you like, someone you appreciate, someone you love. Breathing while feeling caring. And third, breathing while feeling cared about. Keeping it simple again, just what's it like to be with someone who's friendly, maybe a pet, a dog, a cat, could be a grandparent, a teacher, a partner, a lover, group of friends. Breathing while feeling cared about. Okay. Now, to the extent that you can do it, which could be challenging, just on demand right there, but with practice, we become much more able to drop into this. As we get a sense of our body, we engage a part of the brain I've mentioned already, the insula, which is involved with interoception. And as we tune into the body, naturally, there's a heightening of the sense of sensation, which naturally tends to quiet or dial down verbal activity in the brain and centers that are engaged with verbal activity on the left side of the brain for most people. As the insula gets engaged, it also acts as a kind of circuit breaker that quiets activity in a part of the brain called the default mode network, which is very busy with thinking about the future or the past or what's happening to me. So just tuning into the body tends to quiet down, a sense of self-preoccupation, and it also tends to bring us into the present moment. Just that. That's the first breath. And to complete this, as we get a sense of things as a whole, that tends to engage the right hemisphere of the brain, again, for most people, which naturally tends to dial down verbal activity on the left side of the brain, the left hemisphere of the brain. And as we go into that sense of things as a whole in the right hemisphere, activating circuits there, that tends to reduce activation in other parts of the brain that are involved with, as I've said previously, mental time travel into the future and the past and the sense of self. That's just the first breath. In the second breath, as we move into, and in the third breath as well, feeling cared about and caring, that tends to increase oxytocin activity in the brain. And as oxytocin activity in the brain increases, it tends to have an inhibitory effect on anxiety, in part due to activity in the prefrontal cortex and at receptors in the amygdala, where as oxytocin comes in to the amygdala, which is a part of the brain that's kind of like an alarm bell, as oxytocin comes in there, it has an inhibitory effect. It calms down the alarm bell, which is a way in which feeling connected to others, whether it's caring flowing out or caring coming in, helps to calm us, helps us to feel stronger and less worried and anxious about things. Now, I've given you a lot of information here in a short amount of time about just 3 breaths, but it's another way of illustrating, and also doing so experientially, how as we shift our minds, our brain must shift as well, at least in temporary kinds of ways. And sometimes, in ways that can be enormously valuable, the brain can change in lasting ways too. This is a slide from a study on long-term mindfulness meditators from Sarah Lazar and her colleagues at Harvard in 2005. And to quickly summarize the slide, what Lazar and her colleagues found was that long-term meditators had measurably thicker cortical tissue in 3 key regions that were involved in 3 key functions. It's kind of like if you repeatedly engage a particular muscle that's doing a particular function, you're going to tend to build tissue there. And in an analogous way, the same thing can happen in the brain. So region number 1 is the insula, which I've talked about before, very involved with tuning into the internal sensations of the body. And as a bit of a bonus, as we develop tissue in the insula and function in the insula, we tend to be more empathic for the feelings of other people. That's really pretty good. And that's what meditators who are practicing mindfulness, especially mindfulness of the body, were doing again and again and again. They were working that insula, and so they built tissue there. Also, there's a second region. It's the executive territory behind the forehead. These are parts of the brain that are involved in the top-down regulation of attention, action, and emotion. Well, here too, meditators are working that muscle, bringing a wandering mind back, let's say, to the sensations of breathing and staying with their practice for the full period that they've set out to do, let's say. So they're engaging those prefrontal regions that are involved with executive functions, and those get measurably thicker as well. And then the third region on top of the head, somatosensory cortex, they got probably a bonus benefit for repeatedly tuning into their body. Another thing that you can see in the slide in the scatter plot, and I'll kind of explain what you're seeing there, is that we tend to lose some brain cells every day just due to aging. This is a normal process, but we could lose several thousand brain cells a day just sort of normally. And that process of loss of tissue in the cortex is called normal cortical thinning due to aging, which is associated with normal cognitive decline due to aging. Not Alzheimer's, not dementia, but wandering into a room and not remembering why you walked into that room. What are you doing there, Or forgetting where your car keys are, or having a hard time remembering particular words. Well, interestingly, if you look at the scatter plots, which do not show every participant in the study, they're shown here for illustrative purposes, the red square people were the non-meditators who were matched to the meditators in terms of age and other factors like education, social class, gender, and so forth. Well, in terms of cortical thickness, measured in millimeters, which may not seem like very much, but when you can pack probably millions of little synapses into a cubic millimeter, a millimeter matters. Well, the older red square non-meditators had thinner cortical tissue in the three key regions that were investigated here than did the younger non-meditators and the younger meditators. But the older blue circle meditators that you can see in the scatter plots had just as much cortical tissue in those regions as the younger meditators and the younger non-meditators. In other words, because they used it, they did not lose it. Wow, that has lots of implications for everyone, including an aging population. This is the fundamental territory of what's called experience-dependent neuroplasticity, which applies to the ways in which negative experiences can land on us and leave lasting traces behind, much as positive, beneficial experiences can land on us and leave positive changes behind in neural structure or function. It could go either way. I'm focusing here generally on beneficial changes because those are the ones we're seeking to cultivate. So here we have it. Mental activity involves neural activity. Otherwise, we're left with magic. Repeated patterns of mental activity must involve repeated patterns of neural activity. And repeated patterns of neural activity leave lasting changes behind in neural structure or function. This point is summarized in the saying from the work of the Canadian psychologist Donald Hebb, neurons that fire together wire together. So you have the two aspects, fundamentally, of the broad process of learning. There are many mechanisms of this process. I won't go through every single one of them, and there are mechanisms of neuroplasticity that I've not listed here. These are the major ones. I'll just mention some of the highlights. We have lasting changes of neural structure and function through literally new connections forming, making new synapses, or second, sensitizing or desensitizing existing synapses. There can be ebbs and flows of neurochemicals, such as dopamine, norepinephrine, oxytocin, and serotonin. Blood flows will come to parts of the brain that are busier and more active. Another mechanism of neuroplasticity involves changes in the expression of genes in the nuclei of neurons. For example, studies have shown that people who routinely practice relaxation tend to have improved expression of genes that help to calm down the stress response, making them, in effect, more resilient. There can also be greater connectivity between different regions or disconnecting in ways that are helpful between different kinds of regions. There are so many ways in which neuroplastic change that can happen. It's really quite remarkable. Neuroplasticity itself is not breaking news. It's been understood for a long time that as individuals learn to walk instead of crawl, or learned how to stay out of a weird argument, with a friend or a relative, any kind of learning, any kind of lasting change of mind must involve some kind of lasting change in the brain. That's not breaking news. But what is breaking news, what has been remarkable to appreciate in the last 20 or even the last 10 years, is just how extensive the remodeling can be of neural real estate through experience-dependent neuroplasticity, which gives us an amazing power that we can use ourselves to, as I've said, use the mind to change the brain, to change the mind for the better. How do we get more of those green balls into our own brains? And I'd like to talk about that a little bit in the last section of this presentation. We can actually change our brains for the better. How? I love this proverb here because it really speaks to the power of accumulating experiences that are individually small, but which add up over time. Think not lightly of good, saying, "It will not come to me." Drop by drop is the water pot filled. Likewise, the wise one, gathering it little by little, fills oneself with good. That's so hopeful, isn't it? I believe there's a saying or a proverb in Tibet that if you take care of the minutes, the years will take care of themselves. I think that's so hopeful. The most important minute of our life, in my view, is the next one. Can't do anything about the minutes of the past, and the moment itself has arisen, but the next minute is a field of fantastic opportunity. And as we grow more of the good inside of ourselves, that tends to foster positive things in the world around us. As the proverb attributed to Lao Tzu has it, if you keep a green bough in your heart, a singing bird will come. So I'd like to offer some closing reflections here. We can know ourselves in three fundamental ways. We can know ourselves from the outside in, objectively, through science and in terms of our own neurobiology. We can also know ourselves from the inside out, subjectively, through both modern psychology and perennial wisdom. You can think of these as three intersecting circles: neurobiology, psychology, perennial wisdom, and the intersection of these three is a field of tremendous opportunity, tremendous value, and also tremendously cool information and ideas. The intersection of these, as I've said, is ripe with potential. We can bring together, we can combine brain science, modern psychology, including clinical psychology, and the wonderful wisdom of the ages in so many traditions. We can bring it together for personal healing and growth, and for fostering, for supporting a more peaceful and prosperous planet. Thank you.